All right. Should we finish our afternoon? Depending on how quickly we get through this, because we only have we need to go through childhood and then finish up with our adults, and then we will be done for today. So might take us till 3, but we'll see. Okay. So when we did the stage theories, we introduced the idea of socio-emotional development. And what I wanted to do is take a few minutes and go beyond theory about some of the things we know about emotional development of both infants and children. So the first thing that we want to talk about before beyond theory is, when do children develop emotions? Okay. Now, again, I want to emphasize that these are trends, but they're not fixed. So, for example, if an infant isn't smiling socially by 6 weeks, that doesn't mean necessarily there's anything wrong with them. Okay. These numbers basically say that greater than 50% will develop these during this period. Okay, so I just want to keep that in mind, just in case you have one of those grumpy babies. There's nothing wrong with them yet. So, yet is the key term. No, I'm kidding. All right, so what are some of the emotions? And the other part of this is we can ask a baby, so how are you feeling today? Okay, so one thing to also understand is these are emotions of when we can detect them, either through some type of neurological measurement or visually or something like that. So keep that in mind, that these may develop earlier. This is just when we've been able to detect these different emotions. Okay. So at present, at birth, there are some basic emotions that we know are available. Interest, what we call the neonatal smile. Interestingly, the neonatal smile is it's still not understood what the purpose of the neonatal smile is. There's some people who state that the smile a baby has when they're born is because of gas. That's one view. It just feels really good, okay? Other view is that it's a socialization thing, that there's this natural neonatal smile that makes it so adults will attach with the infant more readily. But the confusing part about the neonatal smile is that it can appear without any social cues. Okay, so the room can be totally stressing and a little infant will just randomly smile. Okay. We know that the startle response is available. You can see that, and distress and disgust are also. So if you put something gross like a lemon or something, the baby will show disgust as early as birth. Okay. The next emotion that we can measure to appear is the social smile, around 4 to 6 weeks post-birth, where it's that, as I was talking earlier, it's the mom picks up the baby, feeds the baby smiles, mom smiles back, and we have this social interaction thing. This starts to appear around the 4th to 6th week. Our little tykes tend to have anger and surprise and sadness around 3 to 4 months is when that's been measured, with fear showing up around the 5th to 7th month. We should note really quick, when we get later in the course and we do a presentation on emotions, we're going to be talking a lot about the amygdala, okay? Because the amygdala is kind of the seat of all emotional expression. It kind of goes off or on, dependent on emotional cues. The amygdala primarily responds, though, to fear. It is our fear detector, okay? And the reason why I mention this is you notice that it develops, though, around the 5th to 7th month, yet disgust and anger and social smile have developed before then. So the question becomes is, how can we experience emotions before the most primary emotion that the amygdala responds to starts? And the answer is all of these different emotions up to fear are produced by a different area of the brain. They're produced by the gastral response areas of the brain, okay? For example, when you look at somebody who just annoys you, anyone have one of those people in your life? Okay, you just look at them and you go, ugh, that person, right? So, interestingly, it's not your emotion centers that are firing when you have that experience. It is the digestive areas of the brain that are firing. The same areas of the brain when you've eaten a piece of moldy bread, okay? So our social disgust and social smiles and all of that use the same system that our digestive system uses to detect awfulness or disgust, such as bad food or tainted food, okay? This will become important when we talk later about social psychological concepts, because it is the digestive system that actually regulates your hate or your disgust, hence the word gustorial, disgust comes from. So, but fear, shame, guilt, these are all regulated by the amygdala, which is again, the emotional center of the brain. And it starts to develop around 5 to 7 months. And then based on a fear response, we start to develop things like shame and shyness, contempt and guilt by the age of 2, okay? Moving on, we see broader types of emotions and emotional expressions that occur. So around 2 to 3 years, we start to develop an emotional vocabulary. And this is important, period, especially as parents, in that we should make sure that we're making sure that we label emotions correctly, okay? So there is a association between childhood experiences of abuse and later on getting in abusive relationships as an adult, okay? One of the explanations for that comes to emotional labeling, okay? So I want you to imagine a really abusive parent, which a parent represents what to a child? Authority, what else? It's an L word. Love, okay? Parents represent love. They represent all of the other things that come with love, such as authority, establishing safety, blah, blah, blah. But parents, especially mom, is the definition of love, right? Or should be. Okay, all right. Now, I want you to imagine being a little child. Mom, dad are very, very abusive. But they also say, I love you. They abuse, I love you. They abuse, I love you. What is getting mislabeled? Love. They come to understand love represents pain. And pain, therefore, represents love. So later on, when these children start to get into adult relationships, if the man is not producing pain, what is he not doing for that woman? We'll use a woman as an example. He's not loving her, okay? Because as a child, she labeled love with the pain she was receiving from the parents. And so as an adult, you find a loving man, a truly loving man, and that feels uncomfortable. That feels inconsistent with your cognitive model of what love is supposed to be. But you feel really comfortable around men or women or whoever that represent pain, okay? And that's why we think that a disproportionate number of children who are in really abusive homes tend to end up in abusive relationships as adults because of that mislabeling during the 2 to 3 year age, okay? 4 to 5 years, we show an increased capacity to reflect verbally on emotions and consider complex relationships. Now, this is kind of consistent with Erikson's model, right, about interacting with other people and making complexity out of the situation. When we talk about complex emotions, we're talking about how you can love yet hate something at the same time. Okay, 2 contradictory emotions, but we can do that. There's people who love to hate their parents, okay? And it's around 4 to 5 years old that we're able to start to express those complex emotions, okay? Middle to late childhood, we start to experience pride and shame as more of a complex emotion, meaning that we understand that shame and pride can have both a positive connotation, it's good to be prideful in what you do, and a negative connotation. Being over prideful means you're being over boastful, okay? Understanding more than one emotion can occur at the same time. The ability to account for what leads to emotional reactions. And we start to, around middle to late childhood, have the improved ability to suppress certain emotions, okay, and emotional reactions. So this is where we learn that if someone ticks us off, we don't necessarily have to set off right there and then. We can do it later, okay? But this usually doesn't occur until middle to late childhood, okay? And then adolescence, due to increased hormones, of course, we see the notions of mood swings, that we can go from highs to lows within a few minutes for some adolescents, and that emotions are not necessarily a stable thing, that they can be high or low, and that sometimes it can be due to the body's hormones, or sometimes it can be to the situation, okay? All right. So those are the emotions and how emotions develop over time, anyways, from what we can observe. And again, when we're talking about these age groups, what we're talking about is the propensity of a 50% probability of it occurring. So it's better than chance a little bit, okay? I mentioned also when we were talking about Erikson that we were going to talk more about attachment, okay? Attachment it can simply be defined as an emotional bond with a particular person, okay? When we're talking about infants, we're usually talking about the infant and the primary caregiver, usually represented by the mom, okay? And we know that parents or caregivers become a secure base for exploration in order for a child to venture. It's an important attachment relationship, okay? As I mentioned, and I got it wrong, it's actually macaque monkeys that Harlow did research on, not chimps, but from earlier I said that. As I said, early theorists like Freud believed that attachment occurred through just breastfeeding, that there was no other need for anything else other than for the mother to breastfeed. That created the attachment, and boom, we're done, okay? As I said, in 1958, Harlow disproved this by putting baby macaque monkeys in a cage with 2 artificial mothers. One provided nourishment but was made of wire. The other was made for comfort, made with terry cloth. And what we found is that when the monkey were frightened, for example, it would go to the terry cloth mother and not the wire mother, meaning that it's not just about nourishment. There's something about comfort that infants need in order to be attached to somebody. Okay. Based on his research with macaque monkeys, Harlow then went and did some research on human babies, and he kind of came up with kind of these stages of attachment. So birth to 6 weeks, we see a pattern of what we call joint attention. That's that baby cries, mom shows up, feeds the baby, and then we have that reciprocal relationship with each other. Okay. From 6 weeks to 6 to 8 months, we see attachment in the making. This is where the idea of stranger anxiety starts to occur. So somewhere around 6 weeks, well into the 6th to 8th month, when an infant is handed to a stranger, normally the infant has some type of anxiety reaction. Okay. The absence of that anxiety reaction actually denotes some type of attachment issue that might be developing within the infant. Okay, so stranger anxiety becomes an important marker in understanding the attachment of the infant. Okay, transitioning from 6 to 8 months to 18 to 24 months, we have what we call clear-cut attachment. Okay. And this is marked by stranger anxiety is starting to be reduced because the infant has now learned what kind of strangers are safe and what kind of strangers are not. But this tends to be marked by what we call separation anxiety. Okay, a quote unquote normally developing child, when first left with a stranger, should have some type of anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean they bawl and they cry, but they have some apprehension of being left by their primary caregiver. Again, absence of that separation anxiety denotes attachment issues. Okay. But on that same thing, an exaggerated separation anxiety also denotes attachment issues. So if a child cannot settle themselves down in the absence of their caregiver, that also denotes some issues. Okay. And then we have goal-corrected partnerships, which start to develop after 18 months. And we'll actually talk about this internal working model. So I'm going to pause for that one for just a minute, okay? But what I want to talk about is different type of attachment styles and how we come up with it. Research on attachment was done by John Bowlby and Ainsworth, okay? Who set up what's called the stranger situation. And this is an experiment where a child comes into the lab with mom and dad, and with mom usually, and in some cases mom and dad, and comes into a playroom. Okay, sometime during the play, the parent will get up and leave. In some situations, the child will be left alone. In some situations, the child will be left with a complete stranger working for the experimenter. So let's keep that qualified, okay? And then the parent will return. And what they're looking for in these tests is how will that child use the parent when they return? Will they use them as the secure base and go up to them and make sure everything's okay? Or will they have an exaggerated reaction? Or will they just not even care that mom and dad or mom just showed up again? Okay. And so this is kind of what the stranger situation does. And so this is what what has resulted from these types of experiments is that there are basically 4 types of attachment, okay? Secure attachment is when a child is able to use a parent as a secure base. They're able to explore freely when the caregiver is present. When the caregiver returns, the child seeks out the caregiver and is easily soothed by the caregiver, meaning that the child is easily calmed once the parent returns. What we find is that a secure attached child tends to have a mother who is responsive to the infant's needs, okay? The second type of attachment is anxious avoidant, okay, or insecure organized. What happens is this is a child who, in the situation when the parent is there, can explore with or without the parent. I don't give a shit, okay. And then when the caregiver returns, the anxious and avoidant does not seek out the caregiver. The parent will return and the kid will just continue doing whatever the hell they're doing, okay? We find, looking at the mothering aspects, that these children who are anxious avoidant, the mother tends to be emotionally unavailable and has a huge dislike for neediness, okay? So that's kind of the mothering attribution in this one, okay? The anxious ambivalent or resistant child is one when the parent is there, the child stays very close to the caregiver and has a really hard time exploring the room on their own. So this is the leg hugger child, okay? The interesting thing is when the caregiver returns, the child can either seek and reject contact from the caregiver. So what it basically looks like is, if you're my mommy, I'll go up to you and go, "Oh, good, you're back," and then I'm done because you left me. I'm going to punish you. Okay, that's kind of what that behavior looks like. Okay. The mothering style associated with this is they might be attentive, but is not response to the baby's cues or needs. So it's the mother who really wants to be a good mother, but they don't pick up on the cues of when the baby needs something. Okay. The disorganized or disoriented, okay, this child, when in the situation with the mother, may freeze, explores in a disorganized fashion, meaning they look dazed and confused, or they'll just stand there like, "I'm not doing anything," okay. When the caregiver returns, they may go to the caregiver, but they'll be looking away, okay? So if they're playing with their toy, they'll look at their toy and they'll go up and say, "Hi, Mom," and then they'll just kind of return to whatever they're doing, okay? What we find with these children is they've been raised by mothers who show intrusiveness, maltreatment, and or emotionally unavailable, confuses and frightens the child. This is basically the child who is being nurtured by a very unstable mother. Okay, one minute she can be very controlling, the next minute she can be, "Why the heck are you even here?" Okay, so based on Ainsworth and Bowlby's work, these are the attachment styles that were identified. Okay, so there are general factors that play into attachment beyond just the early mothering, okay? For example, mothers being sensitive and responsive can both be a predictor of a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. So just because you're an emotionally responsive mother doesn't necessarily secure the healthy attachment of the child, okay? We have found that fathers being sensitive is also important. It promotes secure attachments within children. Infants' temperament helps determine the sensitivity of parents. So if you have a highly reactive child, you tend to have parents who don't handle that reactivity very well, and you can see more insecure attachments growing out of that, okay? There is also biological and cultural influences of attachment, okay? We find that with children who've been neglected, they produce lower levels of oxytocin. So neglect is associated with oxytocin production, which again is associated with attachment or biological bonding, okay? Culturally, we can see that in America and North Europe, we see that we predominantly have an avoidant attachment style is the most common insecure category. Whereas in places like Israel, Korea, and Japan, an anxious ambivalent is the most common type of an insecure attachment, okay? And we think it's because of the difference between individualistic cultures, such as the ones here in the United States that focus on autonomy, and therefore we avoid when we don't want to attach, versus collective cultures that focus on social harmony. That's why we will be ambivalent to the situation to balance that harmony, okay? Now, attachments, the whole basis of attachment is we wanted to know if that early attachment with mom have later life consequences. And probably the most researched consequences is attachment associated with later adulthood relationships, okay? And what we have found is that infant attachment is predictive. Now that's an important word, is predictive of a person's ability to maintain secure relationships in later life, okay? But this comes with a caveat, okay? The attachment style of an infant to influence adult relationships is dependent upon if there's any life circumstances that changes that child or that young adult's attachment style, okay? Because new life circumstances can change, for example, secure relationships into insecure relationships. And interventions can change insecurity to security, okay? So for example, if a person experiences trauma in middle of childhood, say abuse or neglect, if they had a secure attachment in infancy, that can change their attachment style to insecure, which then will influence their later adulthood relationships, okay? So life events, attachment styles in infancy only predict adult attachment if there is no significant trauma or experiences between infancy and adulthood. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so so that's a great example. Let's say you have an infant and the father was present in early childhood and was engaged, and then divorce or whatever it may be separates them. That is one example of a life circumstance that can change that attachment style. Yeah, that's actually a good example. Yeah, okay. The other thing, though, that is interesting that actually predicts a child's adult romantic relationships more than attachment is actually child's later life peer relationships. When I'm talking later life, I'm talking, what is the term? Tween, like that few years before puberty and then the few years during and after puberty. Those peer relationships that young boys and girls have during that period of time is more predictive of the type of intimate relationships the person will get into and the quality of intimate relationships than is parental attachment and attachment style. Okay, so the other takeaway message is attachment styles are not the only thing that predicts adult romantic relationships. There's other things such as peer relationships that also predict adult romantic relationships and actually predict it much stronger than early attachment. Okay. I talked about that internal working model, and this is where attachment styles really become important, because research has shown that attachment, while is somewhat associated with relationships, it's more associated and it's more predictive with the working model the person has of themselves. Okay, so a child who has a secure attachment has a working model that they're lovable, capable, significant, their world is safe, and that they can trust others. Okay, how nice it would be to have that kind of model. Okay, anxious avoidant children and adults see other people as unavailable and rejecting. Okay, they feel like they have to protect themselves. They deny needs, and because they don't want to be rejected, so they avoid relationships in order to avoid rejection. Okay, they do what's expected of them, again, to avoid rejection. And this tends to be the person who has this mental working model. If I do for everyone else, that's the only way I deserve love. Okay, so this is the person who does everything at the neglect of themselves in order to try and obtain acceptance from everyone else. Okay, that is the anxious avoidant type person. Okay, anxious ambivalent, others are unpredictable, sometimes loving and protective, sometimes hostile and rejecting. Remember, this is a child who has a very inconsistent parent, like a bipolar type situation. Okay, they don't know what to expect. They feel like they can't explore, and so the major mental model that they build is, if I can read others and get them to respond, I will get my needs met. Okay. And then the last one, the disorganized, disoriented. My caregiver at times seems overwhelmed by me. Others are abusive, neglectful, emotionally and or sexually, and so I am unable to get my needs met. I don't know how to protect myself. That's the internal working model of a child who has this type of attachment style. So now, so these are kind of attachment styles and the way the child and even the adult starts to interpret their world. And that's probably the more important part of attachment, okay? There's also like with everything, bless you, in our world, extremes, right? And so we also have what we call attachment disorders, and there's basically two types. We have what's called a disinhibited social engagement disorder. This is an attachment disorder in which children approach strangers indiscriminately, not differentiating between attachment figure and others, okay? So this is a child who will go up and they'll grab a stranger's hand and let them take them wherever they want to go, okay? It's important to note that when we're talking about disorders, this is something that is prevalent most of the time in a child's life, and it inhibits normal functioning. Okay, those are the two kind of telltale signs of a disorder. So this child is like this all the time across conditions and across situations, okay, which you can imagine can create some problems, okay. Reactive attachment disorder is a disorder marked by the inability to form attachments to a caregiver, okay? Even if the caregiver can attach to the child themselves do not feel like they can attach. This results in two types of behavior, either acting out, disruptive, and aggressive behaviors, or overly attached behaviors. The child that you're dragging across the floor and won't let go of your leg type child, okay? All right. So here is the interesting thing about these disorders, is I had a good friend who does treatment for attachment disorders. Well, he did. He works for, anyway. And there's some things about this treatment that's important, because these are children who can't behave correctly within a society. They're having a hard time. They've gotten in trouble already, and they're only 4, and whatnot. Okay, so, but one, attachment treatment is 90% treating the parent, 10% treating the child. Okay, and that's the standard for attachment therapy. And the other part of it is that no matter what stage of the treatment they're in, when the child turns 8 years old, they stop, okay? Because attachment therapy is really, really, really effective up until the age of 8. After the age of 8, attachment therapy doesn't work at all. Okay, and so normally the protocol is if the child turns 8, you stop services. Okay. The consequence, though, of not treating attachment disorder is, especially in severe cases of attachment disorders, these then grow into what we call conduct disorders. Conduct disorders are the childhood version of antisocial personality disorder, okay? Conduct disorder, so it usually goes attachment disorder in childhood to the age of 8, conduct disorder from age 8 to about the age of 12 into puberty a little bit, and then antisocial personality disorder from about the teen years on. Okay. Once it gets to the conduct disorder level, there is no effective treatment. It now has become a lifelong management issue, meaning this child is either going to have a probation officer or a case manager in their life for the majority of their life up until the age of about 45. Okay. So this is the consequence of attachment disorders, okay? So while we look at these attachment styles, and I sit here and I say, these can be adjusted and they can be changed and we can work with them, the thing that we really look out for when it comes to attachment issues is attachment disorders. because we can effectively treat attachment disorders, we cannot effectively treat conduct or antisocial personality disorders. It becomes life management at that point. Okay, so that's kind of the importance of looking at attachment. Well, if it's effectively treated, it will stop. Okay, so if you effectively treat attachment disorder, then conduct disorder and anti-personality disorder become predictive within any general sense. Okay, if you don't treat attachment disorder, it's most likely going to turn into conduct and then adult antisocial. Yes. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And that's why we think the treatment is so effective, because the treatment is really retraining the parents to react to the child more appropriately and trying to create a consistent environment for them. So. Right, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Juvie? Juvenile? Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. The greatest predictor of reduction in crime is age. For some reason, for women, their mid-30s, if they've done criminal behaviors around their mid-30s, they just stop. For men around the age of 45 to 46, for some reason, they just stop. And so age, for some reason, for human beings is the greatest stop to criminal behavior than treatment or anything else. So. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So likely it came from that and evolved. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, now that's kind of the mystery, and what kind of makes some of these things disorders is they don't make actual rational sense. Okay, and so you bring up a very good point, pointing out the issues of disorders, right? Because when we say that the person will go with people indiscriminately, that's really what we mean. So when is it a she or he? She is selecting certain caregivers, but she's doing it indiscriminately. So there's actually no features of you versus them and why she chose them. It's just part of the disorder itself. So it actually has nothing to do with personality qualities of the caregiver. It's that these are very indiscriminate decisions that the children are making. Mm-hmm. 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 Exactly. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, that's. Mm-hmm. 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 Whatever. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think when it comes to attachment, I think the one thing parents don't get is it's just not about saying I love you and hugs. It's about consistency and predictability. And that tends to be the two things that drive a lot of these attachment issues, is that the parent becomes unpredictable and inconsistent. And that sounds like a perfect example. So yeah. Yeah. All right, so we're going to move, and we're going to look now into childhood for a few minutes. And so let's jump into this. So I just want to talk a little bit about the body growth. So, and really this graph kind of points it out about this right side is the adult body, and this is how we morph into an adult body from birth to 15 half years is when we normally get our adult body. Is about a 15 and a half is when we fully are proportionate to who we're going to be. And really, childhood is really about refining and defining our gross and fine motor skills, okay? The ability to use a pencil to the ability of hitting a ball across the field. Those are kind of the motor goals of childhood. Children who are delayed in motor growth, there's a disorder called development coordination disorder. And this is a delay in reaching motor skills during certain developmental periods. It can be improved with physical education and physical exercise, but this is a child who tends to be very motorly uncoordinated. So if they're walking a straight line, they actually end up wanting to walk here, but they're walking over there. That's kind of the physical coordination disorder, okay? This is the basic growth chart for children, and as we see, body fat and mass all increase over the years, with again 10 being about that point where we go from reduction in growth to hypergrowth is when we usually see the real large growth spurts is around 10 years of age. Yes. The other thing that starts to occur in childhood, so now we're talking about 3-year-olds to about 10-year-olds. And this is getting younger and younger, okay, is body awareness. As we age, starting around 2, we start to get better with what's called proprioception, okay? What that word is that it's your ability to know where you are in space, okay? So, for example, it's my ability to know that I can take one step forward without hitting the table, okay? That's what this is. And it takes a while for children to do this. This is why, you know, you can see infants run into walls or to doors and all kinds of different places, okay? You should know that that is perfectly normal. But when they're getting around 5 or 6 is when you should see all of that go away. If you don't, then they probably have that disorder on that previous slide, okay? The thing that is associated with our ability to see our bodies in position in space is our body image or our self-awareness, okay? Interestingly, the stronger the proprioception, the stronger, more sensitive we are to our body image. So the better we are at understanding ourselves in space and time and situation, the more sensitive we are to our own body image, okay? And we become more self-aware of it. And this creates, of course, for some children, dissatisfaction in body image and whatnot. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The more we become aware of ourselves in our physical world, we then start to judge ourselves more on our own physical features. It's kind of a one-to-one thing. And we've already talked about a child's sense of sexuality, so there's no reason to go back to that. During early childhood, we see that, of course, we see sypnogenesis for vision, hearing, and language start to diminish during the early childhood years, to where by the age of 6 or 7, we pretty much have all of our hearing and language and sight abilities that we're going to have. Nothing more is going to improve, okay? Between early childhood and adolescence, the brain mass will increase by 25%. We're born with our basic brain mass, and our brain mass will only increase by about 30% during our entire adult life. 25% of that 30% occurs between childhood and adolescence. That 5% occurs between birth and about 5 years. So from birth to adolescence, we're talking about an increase of about 30%, okay? In early childhood, we see myelination of the corpus callosum, which tightens the connection between the 2 hemispheres of the brain. So, and that's tends to be an important event in early childhood, okay? So for just a minute, I do want to focus on some risks in childhood, so we can look at, so these numbers are from 2000 to 2009, so they're a couple years old, but it kind of shows what children are most likely to be injured or die from. We can see that, of course, motor vehicles has always been in the top category, with suffocation, drowning, poisoning, fire burns, and then falls progressively going. But these are the what causes the majority of deaths in childhood from accidents and whatnot. We can see, for example, motor vehicles from 2000 to 2009, there was a decrease of 41%, most likely due to increased car safety and enforcement of car seat laws or safety seat laws, okay, is what we think that decrease is due to. But you can see others increasing, so deaths due to suffocation and poisoning have increased in our modern society or modern age, whereas drowning, falls, and fire and burns have decreased. So these are what our kiddos are experiencing. So any questions on that? Okay, all right. When it comes to abuse, according to probably one of the better studies that I've done, because it had a lot of controls put in it, is that these tend to be our prevalence rates for each of our types of abuse in society. So about a quarter of our kiddos experience physical abuse, about 1/5 will experience sexual abuse, 1/10 will experience emotional abuse, 1/10 will experience physical neglect, and about a third, no, that's not a third, 14.8% will experience emotional neglect. We'll leave it at that. So these are, and again, these are conservative numbers. They're very well controlled numbers, but you can see that a quarter of our population, that's still not very good. Okay, and it's denotable by if we compare ourselves to other countries. Okay, of the 26 modern countries, the United States, China, and Britain have the worst worst records of child welfare and abuse. Okay, we have the highest prevalence and we have the poorest responses. Okay, and you'll see this here in another minute when we talk about child protection. Okay, we do better. The United States does better when we compare ourselves to places like Mexico and South Africa. Our numbers actually start looking better. So, yay us compared to South Africa. Woo! Okay. But yeah, so we do have a long ways to go along with China and Britain in protecting children. We can bring up the example of Denmark. Their murder rate is 0.5% of 0.5 for every 100,000. To give you a comparison, the United States is 5.6. Okay, they've almost completely eliminated child abuse. Okay, in fact, they can count the number of child abuse cases in one file cabinet in Denmark now. Okay, and we think it's because in Denmark, when a person gives birth to a child, the state pays their annual salary, and both the mother and the father stay home for the first year of the child. Kind of an interesting thing, but so. This is what I'd keep having kids. See, you would be off right now. You need to move to Denmark. So this is kind of our response. So approximately there was about 6.3 million reports of child abuse to CPS per year, but on average, only 3 million will ever get investigated. Okay, and this is of child between 2 to 7. Of those who are reported, 78% are neglect, 18% are physical abuse, 9.3 are sexual, and 8.5 are psychological maltreatment. Now, notice from that other chart from the Kaisers and CDC, they're almost flipped, right? Because it should be 25% for physical abuse and 20% of sexual abuse. But these are the only ones getting reported at that lower rate, okay? So we know that a lot of abuse is going on that simply is not getting reported, okay? So only 1 in 2 cases are ever investigated. In fact, during last summer, I was doing some contract work with the Office of Inspector General, who does trafficking investigations. Okay, in an average month here in Arizona, there are something like 300 reports of trafficking. Okay, of those 300, only 5 to 10 of them will ever get investigated. Okay, so again, we have a lot of work to do, and this is why we have such a poor rating here in the United States as far as our response to abuse and neglect to children. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah. So you have firsthand experience with this, right? And it's an interesting situation. And again, this is why out of the 26 modern countries, we're one of the 3 that have the worst record. So from working in the field, I think it's a lack of resources, definitely. You know, with the Office of Inspector General, they only get about 5 or 6 investigated because they only have 4 or 5 investigators. So, and they all have caseloads from the previous months and sometimes the previous years that they're still working on. So. Mm, yeah. Mm, mm, mm. Mm, 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 mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think we have kind of 2 issues here. Is 1, we don't have sufficient resources, but 2, we have a reactive system instead of a proactive system. So for example, in Denmark, they're proactive. So they make sure families have everything they need to successfully raise a child. They give them a year off for that first year of bonding and everything. And they're there to support the family system from the beginning. Where here in the United States, we have a reactive system. We go ahead and say, have as many kids as you want, do it, do it, do it. And we're only going to react to the situation, but we're not going to be there to support families and support the situation, if that makes sense. So, let's see. Let's talk though, again, and I think this goes back to it. So the first thing I want to say about this is these are risk factors, these are not causal, okay? So children are at more risk for abuse if these conditions are present. That doesn't mean they are going to be abused. Okay, I want to make that very clear. On the mother's end, in fact, this is the biggest predictor of child abuse. The number one predictor of child abuse is being born to a mother between the age of 18 and 23. Interesting, it is also the biggest risk factor for infanticide. Okay, so infanticide, which is killing an infant, child sexual abuse, and child neglect. The biggest predictor is having a mom between the age of 18 and 23. Okay, why do you think that is? Because it's not the mom that's sexually abusing the children. 99.9% are men. Physical abuse is a 50-50 split. Neglect is largely a female phenomenon, but it's mainly due to lack of resources. So why do you think it's this age group that is the biggest predictor for those things? Any guesses? Okay. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing, is the immaturity, maybe, decision making, those kinds of things. So the second biggest predictor is an absent father. Okay. And so the combination of those two really have an effect on the rates of child abuse that we see within a population. Okay. Other risk factors is when we combined mother and father, we find that the stability of a relationship, the toxicity of the intimate relationship, and the toxicity between mother and father, the situational stability, response to stress and changes, education levels, and viewing of being a parent. All of these in combination, mother and father, tend to contribute to the risk factors of child abuse. Okay, so yeah, so those are it. So interestingly, we have tried proactive responses to this. So, for example, I think it's Oregon, Hawaii, and Minnesota. I know definitely Hawaii had what we call a home visitation program. So if a woman gave birth to a child and she was between 18 to 23, they would assign a home visiting nurse. The nurse would go to the house at once a month, and they would do a wellness check on the child, and then they would do parenting skills with the mother and the father if the father was present. Okay. At the time they put this program in, Hawaii had one of the biggest problems of child abuse in the nation. It was like ranked 1 or 2 for rates of child abuse. Okay. Within about 3 or 4 years, they actually saw a 62% reduction in child abuse rates in the state of Hawaii. Okay. But with all good things are expensive. Okay. And so when Bush, you remember Bush did those tax cuts. Okay. One of the funding streams that went with the Bush tax cuts were the funding that went to these home visitation programs. And since those home visitation programs have been cut, we've seen increases in rates of child abuse within Hawaii. And I believe Oregon and Minnesota had similar programs. So with every good, there becomes a bad, because they're usually pretty expensive, but we saw huge reductions in children being harmed within those states that did those type of programs. So. Probably not, because we saw the same rates of change in Oregon and Minnesota as well. So, and we think it's just because the mother actually felt supported and she was learning skills and how to take care of her child, and there was someone there watching. You know, so we think that had a lot to do with it. But again, when funding gets cut, so does research. So, no, oh, it was only mothers between 18 and 23. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think Hawaii went up to 24, if I remember right. So, yeah. Okay. All right, so that's that. We've already talked about that. Talked about that. Talked about that. I think we're okay with that. So we might get out of here a little bit early if that's okay with everyone. Well, okay. All right. So, okay. So the last thing that we need to go through is we need to talk about early, middle, and late adulthood, okay? And we're going to take it from Erikson's socio-emotional perspective. And there's 3 basic stages that he defined in adulthood, okay? Take my markers. So we can continue on from the identity and identity confusion, and we can go over here into early adulthood, okay? So again, if we take all of these factors that we've been talking about, we have someone with a healthy attachment, they've grown to have autonomy, good initiative, so they have good work ethics, they have value, and they've been able to develop a strong sense of identity. This sets this young person up in early adulthood to develop what we call healthy intimacy. Healthy intimacy, according to Erikson, is the ability to get into a relationship that is healthy, meaning that non-abusive, loving, and caring, but with every relationship becomes conflict, the ability to resolve conflict easily, okay? So that's healthy intimacy, according to Erikson, okay? He separated that from someone who is isolated. Now, when we're talking isolation, what we're talking about is psychological isolation, not physical isolation, okay? This is someone who has lived in this chaotic environment, doesn't have a well-formed identity, doesn't feel industrious, and so they approach relationships in one of 2 ways, okay? One is that they attach to non-human objects, okay? So this is the young adult who becomes a workaholic and invests all of their energy into work or school, okay? This is the stereotypical dog guy and cat woman, okay? They are investing their intimate energies into owning a dog or a cat or a really nice car. And they tend to avoid human intimate relationships, okay? That's one form of psychological isolation. The second form of psychological isolation is when you have someone who really, really, really wants a relationship, but it gets to be about 6 to 8 months into the relationship and they break it off, only to get into another relationship shortly thereafter, okay? So let's talk about why is it they would get in these relationships and then 6 to 8 months they'd all of a sudden break it off, okay? First of all, when we get in a relationship with someone, do we show them our bad side right off the bat? Yeah, yeah, I'm totally honest up front. He's knowing what he's getting, right? Typically, we show the best us in the beginning of a relationship, right? So they get to see, you know, the person who does their dishes, does their laundry, makes their bed, eats with a fork instead of their hands. Okay, I'm thinking of everything I don't do. But then sometime around the 6th to 8th month, you're sitting there on the couch and you lift up a cheek and you let out a fart. Okay, right? Eventually it's going to happen. You start to not make sure the dishes were done when they come over. You leave your dirty underwear on the floor. Okay? You don't always have the perfect makeup. Okay? What happens is us as humans are horrible at capping our inappropriate behaviors, quote unquote, or our natural behaviors. And eventually, those bad habits that we were trying to hide start oozing out. And they start coming out in herds. And what that does is it makes the relationship real. Okay? It's no longer fairy tale land. Okay? Also, around the 6 to 8 month, the guy or the girl might give you the house key, or you notice that you have an extra toothbrush over there and whatnot. Okay? What's happening is that the relationship is being real, and there's the sense of commitment. Okay? The combination of those two things become very, very scary to the psychologically isolated. So what do? They jump out of that relationship very quickly, but because they don't want to be alone, they jump right into another relationship. Okay? Does that make sense how that works? Okay? So those are the two types of isolation. Either we'll invest our intimate energy into non-human objects, or we will last in a relationship until commitment and reality hit. Okay? So this usually is a job, according to Erickson, of young adulthood. Okay? Trending right now, we're finding that the issue of intimacy isolation appears in early adulthood and returns around mid-adulthood after the divorce. Okay? And one is not predictive of the other. You could have healthy intimacy in time 1 and become a total isolate in time 2. Okay? So the caution I would say at this point about intimacy versus isolation is this is not a static thing that only happens in early adulthood. It's predictive that it will occur again sometime in middle adulthood. Okay? But following Erickson's timeline, in middle adulthood, we have the crisis that he called generivity versus self-absorption. Okay? According to Erickson, somewhere in middle adulthood, we're talking 30s, 40s, 50s, we tend to think about our life and what life has given us. Okay? So if we think about this trajectory right here, the person who's going to develop generivity, he or she thinks back and goes, gosh, I have a good relationship. My kids are good. Yeah, the 17-year-old is sometimes a pain in the butt, but you know what? All in all, they're doing good. I do good at work. There's a few people that annoy me, but in general, I've lived a pretty good life. Okay? This person, according to Erickson, will develop generivity, meaning because life has been good to me, I will start giving back to life. Okay? And so this is the person who is now going to invest in being part of the city council, or donating their time at the local food bank, or going to their church and donating time and service there, or being a Cub Scout or a Scout leader of some type. is that these tend to be the times when individuals start to come back, okay? Where Erickson feels this occurs is this is the age range where we see people being more, what is the term I'm looking for? More socially engaged in helping and welfare and giving back in church. Okay, so this is where he gets this notion of generivity. Okay. The other possibility, though, is a person can develop self-absorption. Okay. This is where the person looks back and goes, geez, I'm 36. I've been married and divorced 4 times. My kid's in jail. My daughter is living at a crack house. I can't keep a job. And geez, my neighbors hate me. Is that bad enough? Okay. All right. According to Erickson, this person runs the risk of becoming self-absorbed. Okay. Meaning, what they're going to do is they're going to look back on their life and they're going to try and figure out what experiences did they miss that made their life so miserable. Okay. So this is the stereotypical middle-aged man who goes and gets a sports car and an 18-year-old girl. This is the stereotypical middle-aged woman who goes back and gets a facelift and a boob job. Okay, in that according to Erickson, these individuals are doing is they're trying to figure out what experiences that they missed in their life that has made their life so miserable. Okay, so they're going back and trying new things. So trying a young lady, trying a sports car, trying cosmetic surgery, trying to figure out where they went wrong. Okay, now the self-absorbed person again has 2 options. Okay, one, the study of self-absorbed is that they wreak havoc on families. Okay, if you have a person like this in your life, be careful of them because they really, really wreak havoc on the family system. Okay, but hopefully what happens is that they realize that they really didn't miss anything and all this junk that they've bought was meaningless, and that maybe it's them that is causing the problems in their life. So there's a few that will get out of it, and these are the people who will go, for example, back to school or go and try and improve their life somehow, go to AA or whatever it may be. Okay. And then there are some people who will get stuck in that self-absorption cycle. Okay. So that's what we have to look forward to in our middle years. Okay. Now, going along our trajectory, in late life, when we're really seeing that there's an end, our siblings, our parents have passed away, close friends have passed away, we start to evaluate life, but we do it a little bit differently, okay? In that, according to Erickson, what we do is we redefine immortality. In our younger years, we define immortality as a physical immortality. That if I stay young, I exercise, I have clear skin, I get rid of the wrinkles and all that kind of stuff, that I will stay physically young forever. Okay? Laugh at that. Okay. But that's what we think when we're younger. Okay? As we age, we start to realize that immortality is something different. Immortality is about how we're going to be remembered when we're no longer here. Okay? Immortality is knowing that my great-great-grandchildren will know my name. Okay? A person going through this in later life, if they've had a good life, maybe they made some changes in their workplace that caused this change in the way the business is run. And they did a good job raising their kids and their intimate partner, and the grandkids come and visit them and all that kind of stuff. This is somebody who's going to evaluate their life with what Erickson called ego integrity, meaning I can live the rest of my life happy because I know I'm going to be remembered. And so I can exist without worry, okay? On the other end of the spectrum is someone who is in despair. They look at their life and they realize their life has been a series of huge mistakes. That their family doesn't come visit them. That jeez. Okay. And that family doesn't come and visit. Grandkids don't even know their name. And so this is the person who was going to show up to the nursing home, going to sit on the front porch and go, I'm done. And they live out the rest of their life in a depressive, despaired state. Okay? That's an awful look on things. Okay? Now, there are a few people, though, especially today, with our longer lifespans and our medical abilities to keep people more mobile later into older age, that actually can reverse the despair, though. We see a lot more older individuals who will go back to school, who will engage themselves into society and will do things. And so despair doesn't always mean, at least in our modern times, just the end. It can also be a motivating force for some older people. Okay. All right. You guys had enough for today? All right. Do you have any questions? We will be, I just haven't decided how. So next time, at our next meeting, we'll talk about midterm and we'll go over how that's going to look. But I want to be able to give you guys a study guide and be able to study for it. So yeah. So keep your notes, and what I'll do is I'll bring a study guide to our next meeting, and we'll do a midterm the following meeting. Okay? Yeah, you'll have the PowerPoints, and you have all the videos too, and all that. So you should have plenty of, and I'll remember the PowerPoints from today next time as well. Okay? Any other questions? All right, we're out of here a half hour early. Have a good week.